Dobro. History. Archive.
Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving into a singular, devastating tragedy. It's a story that involves a small military patrol boat, 17 lost souls, and a secret so politically toxic, so dangerous, that a military regime buried it for 40 years.
Right. This is the story of the Korea Coast Guard Patrol Boat 72, P-72.
And what makes this deep dive so compelling is that we're not just looking at one moment in time. We are synthesizing three totally distinct periods.
We are. You have the suffocating political terror of South Korea in 1980. Then you have the raw, chaotic physics of the accident itself. And finally, the modern scientific triumph in 2019 that finally dragged the truth into the light.
And the silence. It wasn't just the ocean that kept this secret.
Well, the silence was imposed by the state. It was a deliberate act of erasure.
So to set the scene for everyone, you have to transport yourself back to the night of January 23rd, 1980. We're talking about the EC. It's freezing, it's pitch black, and it's pure chaos. The sources we have describe these massive, just terrifying 4-meter waves.
13-foot waves. I mean, it's almost impossible to imagine.
And now picture a tiny vessel.
Yeah.
Just 60 tons. The P-72 trying to navigate that. It didn't stand a chance. It was instantly swallowed.
It was a catastrophic, immediate loss. 17 men went down with that ship.
And it was a mix of people, right?
Yeah. 9 were career Coast Guard officers, the seasoned professionals. But the other 8 were young conscripted combat police. Students basically serving their mandatory duty.
And the vessel was just gone. No distress signal, nothing.
Vanished.
And here is the core agonizing contradiction. The reason a cover-up was so essential for the regime, they weren't sunk by the enemy. It wasn't North Korea.
No, they were destroyed in a catastrophic, friendly collision, smashed by a much larger South Korean patrol ship, the P-207.
And for almost 4 decades, the full story of that mistake, the disastrous decision-making, the operational failure in that storm, the just sheer negligence of the command structure. It was, in the words of later investigators, suffocated by a military regime.
It wasn't just forgotten. It was actively, deliberately erased from the records.
So our mission today is ambitious. We're going to reconstruct the chain of events that led to the accident. We'll explore the incredible geophysical science that Kiosk used to finally find the wreck.
And, critically, we're going to examine the architecture of that 40-year silence. We need to show why this brand-new military junta saw the truth as a threat to its very survival.
A small vessel, a deadly storm, and 4 decades of state-sponsored lies. Let's start the deep dive.
To really get why this friendly fire accident had to be covered up so completely for so long, you have to anchor yourself in the political reality of South Korea in early 1980.
It was a moment of absolute instability.
It really was. This wasn't a time for mistakes. The sources call it a time of political vertigo.
Because the entire political structure of the state had basically just collapsed a few months earlier, right?
Exactly. President Park Chung-hee, who'd been this iron-fisted dictator for almost 2 decades, he was assassinated in October of '79.
So the whole structure of power was suddenly up for grabs. Incredibly dangerous.
A total power vacuum. And the man who ruthlessly filled it was Major General Chun Doo-won. He staged the infamous 12.1 military coup on December 12, 1979.
And we have to really stress the timeline here. The coup happened just 6 weeks before the P-72 went down.
6 weeks. So that means this emerging dictatorship, what would become the Fifth Republic, was in its most vulnerable, its most paranoid embryonic stage.
It had seized power illegally, violently.
Yeah.
And its entire claim to rule, its whole reason for being, rested on this one single fragile idea.
Absolute national security, the military's total, unwavering infallibility.
And this is the key. This is the analysis that sealed P-72's fate.
It is. This new regime was constantly looking over its shoulder. It was terrified of internal dissent, of looking weak to the outside world.
So it couldn't afford any perception of incompetence.
Yeah.
Not for a second. Especially when it came to the maritime border, which is a huge symbol of state strength.
To admit a friendly fire accident while you're chasing a phantom enemy? I mean, that was an absolutely unacceptable political cost.
So that political desperation, that paranoia, it translated immediately into how they operated on the ground. Or, I guess, on the water.
It trickled right down the chain of command. You had this atmosphere of martial law, of hypervigilance that Chun Doo-won imposed.
So for a commander, admitting a failure
was career suicide, or worse. Especially a failure that cost a vessel and 17 lives. It didn't matter if there were extenuating circumstances, like a historic storm.
So commanders just knew ambiguity had to be treated as hostility.
And success was measured by aggression, not by caution. If you admitted you made a mistake, you risked exposing the whole regime's operational weakness. It was a systemic fear.
And that fear would have trickled all the way down to the crews on these tiny patrol boats.
Of course. They were operating in a climate where being cautious could be seen as being a coward, and being aggressive, even if it was based on the flimsiest evidence, was what got rewarded.
The standing orders were clear then.
Crystal clear. You see a blip on the radar near the northern limit line. You engage. You interdict. In this paranoid environment, hesitation was just not an option, and that set the stage for absolute disaster when you throw in the weather the P-72 was facing.
Okay, let's pivot to that. The literal maelstrom. The sources call the conditions the winter of terror. We really need to understand the physics of the storm that night.
Well, the East Sea in January is a brutal, brutal place, and it's mostly because of something called the Siberian High.
Okay, what's that?
You get these extremely cold, dense air masses from the continent flowing out over the relatively warmer sea surface, and that massive temperature difference provides the energy source for what meteorologists call explosive cyclogenesis.
Explosive cyclogenesis. That sounds bad.
It is. We can just define it as rapid, violent storm intensification.
So this wasn't just a heavy storm that rolled in slowly. It was one that could blow up suddenly and intensely, catching ships off guard.
That's it exactly. And on the night of the 22nd into the 23rd, the conditions were classified as bordering on chaotic.
And we have the data on this.
We do. Meteorological records confirm sustained wave heights of over 4 meters. Now, you have to think about the scale of that for a moment. That's 13 feet. For a vessel like the P-72, which was only about 25 meters long, the waves were half the length of the ship itself.
I can't even fathom that. That level of sea state means the crew is dealing with more than just rough seas.
Oh, it's a battle for survival. They're dealing with near zero visibility from the sea spray, this constant violent pitching and rolling motion, and just immense psychological strain.
And on top of all that, the extreme cold added another deadly factor: ice accretion.
This is critical. The air temperature was well below freezing, so
Right.
all that constant spray hitting the superstructure, the masts, the railings, the radar dome, it turned instantly to ice.
We mentioned this briefly, but let's really expand on the physics here. Why is a few centimeters of ice a potential death sentence for a small vessel?
It all comes down to stability. And naval architects measure that using something called metacentric height. When ice builds up, it accretes high above the waterline. This raises the vessel's center of gravity. And when that center of gravity moves up, the vessel becomes structurally less stable. It loses its ability to right itself after it rolls in a wave.
So even a small accumulation of ice dramatically increases the risk of capsizing. It turns the boat into a top-heavy death trap, just waiting for the next big wave.
Precisely. The P-72 was already unstable in those 4-meter seas. The ice buildup would have just destabilized it even further, making it incredibly difficult to navigate or even just maintain course.
And their primary tool, their main defense and navigation aid, the radar, was effectively blinded.
Yes. Blinded by the very environment they were trying to patrol. The conditions rendered their 1980s-era radar almost useless because of sea return.
Which we mentioned earlier.
Right. When the waves are that high, the crests of the waves themselves reflect the radar energy back to the dish. It creates this blizzard of false echoes on the screen.
So it's almost impossible to tell the difference between a real small target, like a fishing boat or a spy boat, and just the acoustic clutter of the storm itself.
They were flying blind,
Right.
straight into a political imperative.
Well, let's focus now on the ship itself.
Yeah.
The P-72, it wasn't a warship. It was really a small workhorse of the Coast Guard.
A very small workhorse. P-72 was a diminutive vessel, likely a variant of the U.S. point-class cutter design.
And the size is just staggering when you think about the conditions. 60 tons.
60 tons of displacement, maybe up to 69 when it was fully loaded, was barely 25 meters long. You know, about the length of 2 semi-trailer trucks put together.
And they were built for speed, not for this kind of punishment.
Right. They were robust, but they were fundamentally designed for rapid coastal interception, for chasing smugglers in calmer waters, not for fighting a full-on North Pacific gale.
As the sources say, it was punching far, far above its weight class that night.
And that lack of weight, that lack of mass, it just compounded the tragedy. While the steel hull was fine for light duty, it offered basically zero protection against a kinetic collision.
When it came to a crash with a vessel 3 times its size.
It was instantaneously overwhelmed.
And the internal design of the ship guaranteed a rapid, catastrophic sinking. We have to talk about that lack of compartmentalization.
That is the key technical weakness. Unlike modern naval vessels or larger frigates, the P-72 design didn't have extensive, resilient, watertight compartments.
So on a bigger ship, a breach might flood one section, but the bulkheads hold, giving the crew time to react.
Exactly. But for the P-72, a breach into the main engineering space, especially a massive one like this collision caused, it would lead to what the reports call rapid, catastrophic flooding.
They wouldn't have even had time to fully comprehend what had just happened.
No, let alone initiate any kind of basic damage control.
The flooding would have just been overwhelming.
The ship likely rolled, lost all its stability, and sank within minutes, maybe even seconds. Just a complete loss of buoyancy from that breach.
Unbelievable. Now let's turn to the human cost. Those 17 men. We know 9 were career officers, but 8 were the 𝐃𝐈𝐕𝐄, the conscripted combat police. For our audience, what exactly was that distinction, and why is it so important here?
Well, the 9 officers were the professional corps. They were the captains, the engineers, the navigators, men who were often serving long careers at sea.
And the 𝐃𝐈𝐕𝐄.
The 𝐃𝐈𝐕𝐄 were different. They were young men, usually college students or recent graduates, and they were just fulfilling their mandatory military service. They weren't Coast Guard careerists. They were combat police who were seconded to maritime duty.
So they were sons and students, really, who were suddenly thrust onto this violent, politically sensitive maritime frontier, and with probably less specialized training than a full-time mariner.
That's exactly right. While the mandatory service is rigorous, these young men were serving on a tiny vessel in the most extreme conditions imaginable. They would have been the least seasoned members of the crew.
Just trying to navigate this cramped, uninsulated hull, probably experiencing intense seasickness.
And dealing with the psychological isolation of being on this tiny, dark speck in a chaotic ocean. Their routine duty was transformed by political paranoia into an extreme peril.
That detail really drives home the reality of it. This wasn't a loss of, hardened, lifelong warriors. This was a loss that tore a cross-section through South Korean civilian life.
It was, and it was all because of a combination of political miscalculation and engineering vulnerability.
And they were operating at the very edge of the state's defense structure, physically and politically isolated.
Their sacrifice was immense, but as we're about to see, it was a sacrifice that the state found deeply, deeply inconvenient.
Okay, so the actual sequence of events that led to the collision, it all started with a decision made under incredible duress. At around 5:00 a.m., a contact appeared on P-72's radar screens.
And that political context we talked about immediately dictated how that contact was classified.
No room for doubt.
None. Under the standing martial law orders and the constant high alert from the new Chun regime, any unidentified blip near the NLL was instantly classified as hostile. A suspected North Korean spy vessel, maybe a semi-submersible craft designed for infiltration.
But the sources we've reviewed strongly suggest a high probability that this enemy target, the whole reason for the chase, didn't actually exist.
It was almost certainly a ghost target.
Ghost target.
Yeah. And this is the devastating hypothesis. It's really confirmed by the conditions. We've already established that the 1980s radar was overwhelmed by sea return from those 4-meter waves.
Right.
So think of it this way. Radar works by bouncing pulses off objects. In a massive storm, the crests of the waves themselves can perfectly mimic the size and reflection of a small boat.
Or it could have been something else entirely.
It could have. The chaotic motion of the waves could momentarily lift a piece of debris, a buoy, a large log high enough to register a transient return on the screen.
So the blip could have just been acoustic clutter. But because of the extreme political pressure from the new coup regime, that ambiguity was treated as 100% hostility.
And the order to intercept was given.
That is the tragic, immediate link between the politics and the disaster itself.
It is. The commanders on scene were unable to exercise caution or discretion. They had to prove their vigilance. And that single order to aggressively intercept this ghost target meant that 2 friendly vessels, P-72 and the larger P-207, were now being routed to the exact same phantom coordinates.
At the precise moment the storm was at its absolute peak.
A collision course.
So let's look at the physics of that disaster. The 2 vessels were vastly different in size. The small 60-ton P-72 and the much larger 200-ton P-207.
The disparity is crucial. P-207 was more than 3 times the displacement of P-72.
And in a dark, chaotic sea with terrible visibility and high motion, both crews were likely just fighting to control their own ships.
Right. They were fighting the waves, not actively looking for another friendly ship in the chaos. The impact would have been just devastating. The sources describe it as being akin to a steel hammer striking an eggshell.
Yeah, and we know where the collision happened on the ship.
Based on later testimony and the damage reports from P-207, which survived, the prow of the larger vessel struck P-72 amidships, or maybe near the stern engine compartment.
And P-207 was moving at speed.
It was. The kinetic energy that was released was catastrophic. The impact caused immediate total structural failure.
So what were the immediate consequences for the crew inside the P-72?
Instantaneous darkness and violent motion. The hull breach would have severed all electrical power immediately. The lights just went out.
And we talked about the lack of compartments.
Which meant rapid, overwhelming flooding, accompanied by this violent lurch from the collision itself. Egress would have been virtually impossible. Doors and hatches would have been slammed shut by the rolling of the vessel and the sheer force of the incoming water.
And then comes the final lethal element, the frigid sea. The water temperature was only 2 to 4 degrees Celsius.
That temperature dictates a nearly non-existent survival window. The very first physiological response is something called cold shock, which happens within the first minute.
What's that?
It's an uncontrollable, frantic gasping and hyperventilation. Even if a crew member had miraculously managed to get out of the sinking vessel, the cold shock response would have quickly led to them inhaling water.
And even if they survived that initial shock, hypothermia takes over incredibly quickly.
Within minutes. Incapacitation would occur in less than 15 minutes, even for a healthy adult wearing a life jacket, just due to the rapid drop in core body temperature.
Go for the crew trapped inside a rapidly sinking dark hull.
The tragedy was over almost instantly.
P-72 just vanished from the communications net. P-207, even though it was damaged, was able to report the collision. But the search effort that was launched almost immediately was doomed from the start.
It was doomed by the very conditions that caused the crash. You have 4-meter waves that rendered any visual search attempts completely futile.
Searchlights would have been useless.
Swallowed by the sea. Flares, if any were launched, would have been invisible in the spray and the darkness. The ship was, as one report said, swallowed whole, and the fact that they couldn't find any survivors or debris in the immediate aftermath only made the political need to suppress the full story that much greater.
So the physical tragedy, the sinking itself, lasts just minutes. But the political tragedy, the cover-up, that lasted for 4 decades. This is where we have to examine the mechanism of information control that was put in place by the Chundewan regime. What was the core motive for this complete erasure?
The motive was simple self-preservation. The truth was just absolutely damning.
Let's lay it out.
The state had lost a vessel and 17 of its own men due to operational chaos, to friendly fire, and to an unnecessary chase of an enemy that probably didn't even exist.
And all of this happened within weeks of the military coup.
Exactly. That truth directly exposed the regime's core claim, its claim of military infallibility, as a dangerous lie.
So they had to rewrite the narrative immediately to maintain that facade of competency.
Instantly.
Yeah.
And the first step was obfuscation. The families were given a highly sanitized, very vague account, missing due to an unforeseen accident during operations.
Did they mention the collision at all?
They mentioned the collision with P-207, but only in passing. The critical details, the chain of command breakdown, the ghost target, the intense political pressure, all of that was completely obscured, omitted from the public record.
And the martial law decrees made sure the media couldn't dig into it.
Right. Under martial law, the military had total control over the flow of information. Censorship was absolute.
So news outlets were explicitly forbidden from running investigative stories on military accidents.
Or questioning command decisions. The incident wasn't reported publicly at all, it was just erased. One investigator described it perfectly, saying the incident was sealed in administrative amber.
A tragedy just frozen in time by a bureaucratic order. And that denial of truth had this devastating long-term effect on the families. It created what psychologists call ambiguous loss.
We have to explore this concept. It's the profound human consequence of the cover-up.
What is it exactly?
Ambiguous loss is this unique and agonizing form of grief. It's defined by a total lack of closure. The person is physically absent, there's no body, no gravesite, but they remain psychologically present because the death is never fully confirmed or ritualized.
So the families were just caught in this permanent state of unresolved anxiety.
They were. They knew their sons were gone, but the state was refusing to acknowledge how they died, denying them the truth that's required for any kind of ritual closure.
So the entire mourning process was just frozen. There was no beginning, middle, or end to their grief.
Oh, that's right. They couldn't move past the event because the state was actively lying about it. And the official memorial services just exemplify this cruelty.
The empty coffin.
The empty coffins. Families had to attend these services where they wept over caskets that contained only a uniform or a few personal effects. It was a macabre performance of mourning, designed to satisfy public curiosity without actually giving the families the dignity of their loved ones' remains.
The psychological cost of that must have been just immense. Decades of anxiety about what really happened, and the state denying them any accountability.
And that anxiety was compounded by the final profound insult, the denial of honor.
Right, because the incident was classified purely as an accident, which risked making the regime look bad. The 17 crew members were initially denied the status of national heroes.
They weren't treated as servicemen who died on duty. They were treated as casualties of an administrative blunder, a political inconvenience.
Which meant, for decades, they were excluded from being buried at the National Cemetery.
Which is reserved for those who die honorably in defense of the nation. This classification was devastating. It implied their deaths were somehow less worthy, less honorable than those who died in direct combat.
It's a systemic dehumanization.
It is. It prioritized the regime's political narrative over the human sacrifice of its citizens. And that denial of honor really solidified the cover-up, guaranteeing the incident would just fade into the deepest shadows of history.
It took 40 years. 40 years of persistent, heartbreaking pressure from the families, combined with a huge political shift in the late 2010s toward government transparency to finally get the search authorized.
Right. And KIOST, the Korea Institute of Ocean Science and Technology, took on the mission.
This was a massive undertaking, a complete shift from state-sponsored secrecy to this sophisticated scientific commitment.
It was. And finding a 60-ton vessel that's probably partially covered in silt at a depth of 105 meters, it's not easy, especially in an area littered with debris like rocks and old fishing gear. They had to use every tool in the modern geophysical arsenal.
So what was phase one? How did they start?
They started with side-scan sonar, or SSS. They tow a device, which is often called a towfish, close to the seafloor. And this device emits high-frequency acoustic pulses that sweep the bottom.
And it's looking for reflections.
Exactly. When those pulses hit something hard, like steel, they create a strong reflection, which shows up as a bright spot on the image.
And the sonar also helps identify the shape of the object, right, through the shadow.
Yes, the acoustic shadow. When the sound hits an object that's raised above the seafloor, it creates a shadow behind it, a dark area where the sound couldn't reach. By analyzing the bright spots in the shadows, they can identify potential wreck shapes and distinguish them from, say, flat rock formations.
But SSS has a weakness.
A key weakness. Discarded fishing nets, or ghost nets, can often mimic the signature of a steel wreck. They get balled up on the bottom and look like a solid object.
So to confirm they were looking at a steel hull and not just a big pile of nets, they had to move to phase two.
Magnetic anomaly detection. This is where the physics gets really crucial to the investigation.
This is the step that separates the steel from the stone.
And from the nets. A magnetometer is an incredibly sensitive instrument that's used to measure local distortions in the Earth's natural magnetic field. Because steel is ferromagnetic, a large metal object like the P-72's hull creates a predictable, localized warp in the magnetic field right around it.
So they were basically looking for a magnetic fingerprint that only a 60-ton steel vessel could leave behind.
That's a perfect way to put it. And this is where the engineering precision really came in. They had to calculate the expected magnetic signature of a vessel of this size at that specific depth.
And that calculation told them how to conduct the search.
It did. The result indicated that to reliably detect that signature and distinguish it from all the background magnetic noise, the magnetometer had to be towed within a maximum of 30 meters of the seafloor.
Wow. That's a very narrow margin.
An incredibly precise, narrow margin. And it dictated the entire search grid and the difficulty of the whole towing operation.
It's just amazing that a piece of 1980s history was finally revealed through a hyper-precise calculation made decades later. And after all that effort, the data finally converged on a specific target.
On April 2nd, 2019, they confirmed the discovery using an ROV, a remotely operated vehicle.
And the location was at a depth of 105 meters, What's fascinating is where it was found relative to the original reports.
The margin of error is huge. The wreck was found 643 meters north of the reported sinking position from 1980.
That half-kilometer discrepancy tells us so much about the chaos of that night.
It really does. It highlights the extreme navigational inaccuracies that were just inherent in the pre-GPS era.
Right.
They were relying on less precise radar bearings, dead reckoning, rudimentary communications.
And the ship would have drifted as it sank.
Exactly. It would have been subject to intense winter currents before it finally settled. That 643 meters wasn't a mistake in the event itself. It was a testament to the chaos that followed.
So finally, the ROV goes down, it pierces the eternal darkness of the deep, and it gives us that first forensic snapshot. What did that visual confirmation tell us about the P-72's fate?
The visual evidence was just haunting and definitive. The wreck was found upright, resting on the seafloor, partially buried in silt. It was heavily encrusted with rust and marine growth after 40 years.
And they could confirm the identity.
Without a doubt. Its unique dimensions, 24 meters by 5 meters, and the specific structural elements, like the gun mounts, confirmed it was the P-72.
And here's where we get that truly indelible, heartbreaking image from the ROV footage. The ship was found sitting upright with its guns still trained on the dark.
That image is it's so profound. It's a frozen tableau of sacrifice. The forensic observation confirmed that the men are, quote, exactly where the sea had taken them, resting in the silt. It's a testament to the operational failure that claimed them.
The discovery itself was the ultimate scientific rebuttal to the government's 4-decade effort at erasure.
The ocean kept the truth safe until science was finally able to retrieve it.
To really understand the specific cruelty that was inflicted on the P-72 crew and their families, we have to compare how their case was treated to other high-profile maritime disasters. The divergence shows exactly how politics weaponized their silence. Let's start with a famous American case. The U.S. nuclear submarine USS Thresher, which was lost in 1963.
The Thresher is the perfect contrast. It's a case study in transparency and systemic reform. When that submarine was lost with 129 crew members, the U.S. Navy did not hide the cause.
No, they immediately launched this extensive, highly publicized search and a full board of inquiry.
And that public inquiry led to fundamental, sweeping changes in naval safety protocols around the world.
They found the cause.
They did. The investigation determined the loss was due to a catastrophic piping failure combined with an inability to deballast the submarine quickly enough. The result was the creation of the SubSafe program,
which mandated rigorous new safety standards.
Right. Non-flammable materials, better emergency systems, redundant backups. The loss of the Thresher was an immense tragedy, but it saved countless lives thereafter because the U.S. state immediately acknowledged the failure and, crucially, learned from it.
And the consequence for the P-72, a tragedy just compounded by bureaucracy.
P-72's loss resulted in zero systemic safety reforms. Absolutely none. Because the state denied the true operational context, the chaotic command, the ghost target chase, the political pressure, there was no public mandate and no official acknowledgement of failure.
So the Coast Guard was denied a lessons learned process.
Completely. They covered up the cause, which means similar operational risks likely continued for years. The secrecy didn't just dishonor the men who died, it made future Coast Guard missions more dangerous for those who lived.
Okay, now let's jump forward to a more recent and more immediate South Korean tragedy. The ROKS Cheonan, which was lost in 2010.
This comparison really highlights the difference between a dictatorship's view of sacrifice and a democracy's.
The ROKS Cheonan is almost the definition of military martyrdom in modern South Korea.
It is. When the vessel was sunk by a North Korean torpedo, 46 sailors died, and the Democratic government at the time immediately elevated them to the status of national heroes and martyrs.
The public mourning was immediate and massive, and they recovered the physical evidence.
Yes. The hull of the Cheonan was raised from the ocean floor. It was preserved, and it's now displayed as a national memorial. The men were instantly accorded the highest honors, buried at the National Cemetery, and their sacrifice was woven directly into the fabric of the national defense narrative.
It served a powerful political purpose, right? To unify the nation against North Korean aggression.
It did. But the P-72 crew, they died in a nearly identical context, defending the maritime border against a perceived infiltration. Yet they were left in the cold for 40 years.
So the disparity is purely about political timing and political utility.
That's all it is. The Cheonan sinking occurred in a stable democracy that valued the honor of its soldiers and could use that tragedy to build a national consensus. The P-72 sinking occurred under the Chun Doo-hwan dictatorship, where the regime valued its own power above everything else.
So the Cheonan crew were martyred because their loss served the current political narrative.
And the P-72 crew were forgotten because their truth was inconvenient and exposed the government's failure. It is an extraordinary testament to how political context can completely define the meaning of sacrifice.
So the discovery of the hull in 2019 finally settled the question of where the P-72 was. But it ignited this furious new ethical and engineering debate.
A huge debate.
Should the state attempt to salvage the wreck and repatriate the remains? Or should the P-72 be left to rest at 105 meters?
This is a profound dilemma, and there are strong, completely valid arguments on both sides. The political pressure to raise it is immense, and it's driven by a moral imperative.
Right. You have the families, supported by influential political figures like Representative 𝐃𝐄𝐄𝐏, and they argue that the state has this fundamental, undeniable duty to bring its fallen defenders home.
They've waited 40 years for the truth. They feel they shouldn't have to wait any longer for the bodies.
And for them, leaving the men at the bottom of the sea is seen as a continued dereliction of duty.
It is. For the families, the salvage is the only path to true ritual closure. It's a way to finally lay their sons to rest with the dignity they were denied by the dictatorship for so long. The rallying cry is simple and powerful. The state must rescue them.
But the opposing argument is the cold, hard, often brutal technical reality of deep-sea salvage. It's a massive engineering challenge. What are the specific risks of trying to lift a vessel this old from that depth?
The number one concern is structural integrity. The steel hull has been submerged for 40 years in corrosive salt water. That leads to heavy rust, metal fatigue.
And the pressure down there is immense.
It's about 11 times the atmospheric pressure at the surface. Right now, that immense pressure is actually helping to keep the compromised structural members in place.
So if they try to lift it, the change in pressure and the stress from the lifting cables could cause the whole thing to just fall apart.
That's the fear, that the vessel, which was already weakened by the collision damage and 4 decades of corrosion, would just disintegrate during the lift.
And that would shatter the wreck, scattering the remains across the seafloor.
Turning a unified gravesite into an unrecoverable debris field. That outcome would be a final, devastating blow to the very families who are seeking closure.
And the recovery effort is also complicated by external hazards, specifically these ghost nets.
That is a pervasive and lethal hazard.
Oh.
The area is heavily covered in discarded commercial fishing nets, and these nets are incredibly strong. They create a dangerous entanglement risk for any human divers or even for the ROVs trying to secure lifting cables or examine the interior.
You risk turning the salvage crew into the next casualties.
You do. And finally, even if you can overcome the engineering challenges and the hazard challenges, there is the ever-present hurdle of cost.
This is not a cheap operation.
Deep-sea salvage is exorbitantly expensive. The estimates run into the tens of billions of won. That's equivalent to many tens of millions of US dollars.
And getting a specific budget line item of that magnitude through the National Assembly is incredibly difficult.
Especially when you're faced with competing social and economic demands. That financial hurdle has led to these indefinite bureaucratic delays, which means the debate just continues without any real resolution.
So if politics created the silence in the first place, it's been modern media pressure that has finally broken the bureaucratic inertia and forced the government to keep this debate alive.
The media has played a pivotal corrective role here. Specifically, the SBS investigative program, The Story of the Day When the Tail Was Bitten, or 𝐃𝐄𝐄𝐄, they ran these incredibly compelling segments in 2024 and 2025.
And they used a really powerful storytelling format, the chain reaction. How does that work to impact public opinion?
The chain reaction format doesn't just report the facts, it connects the dots. It links the personal grief of the families to the small, specific details of the accident, and then to the systemic, high-level political suppression.
So reframe the P-72 incident not as some forgotten historical footnote,
but as an active, unresolved human rights violation carried out by the state against its own citizens.
And that kind of sustained public pressure is absolutely essential to forcing any kind of parliamentary action, because it makes the political cost of silence higher than the financial cost of salvage.
Precisely. That media pressure, combined with the tireless family advocacy, has been crucial in forcing the National Assembly to seriously reconsider the salvage budget. It's ensured that this incident can no longer be ignored by administrative fatigue. #tag outro.
The story of the sinking of Patrol Boat 72 is, at its heart, a chilling lesson in political priorities. It represents a tragedy composed of two distinct and I think equally devastating catastrophes.
It really does. First, you have the physical violence of the accident on January 23rd, 1980. And then you have the deliberate, bureaucratic violence of the state-enforced silence that followed for 40 years.
The 2019 discovery by 𝐃𝐈𝐕𝐄 was just a triumph of technology and ethical commitment. And it proved that while a totalitarian regime can successfully bury history for decades, the ocean retains its own uncorruptible records.
It finally gave the families the physical truth, even if it hasn't yet given them closure.
The silence surrounding the P-72 has finally been broken. The 17 crew members are no longer classified as missing. They are simply waiting. They remain on patrol at a depth of 105 meters.
And that image of the 60-ton vessel frozen upright in the silt with its guns still aimed at the darkness, it's just an incredibly powerful final image. It's a profound, silent indictment of the political era that created the culture of fear and infallibility that led to their demise.
And a powerful statement on how governance can fail its most devoted servants. So what does this all mean for us today? The story of P-72 forces us to confront a really uncomfortable truth. When a state values its own political stability or its own narrative of the dignity and honor of its citizens' sacrifice, it commits a second, more enduring tragedy. The fight for the salvage of the P-72 is not just about retrieving remains, it's about reclaiming the historical truth that the state systematically denied. And that is something for you to mull or explore on your own.